Following on from the video that I recorded, it is actually yesterday, which gave an overview of some of the kind of issues around immersive research, ethnography. I'm lucky enough to have Geoff Pearson on, who's going to talk about some of his work, specifically, I think, within football. Geoff's at Manchester University. Geoff, hi, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Excellent. Just want to give us a bit of a kind of intro into what you do, how you do it, maybe your background in academia, some of the kind of broad stuff before we get into some of the detail.
Okay, right. So I'm currently based at the University of Manchester Law School, and I work in socio-legal studies, so looking at the law in its context. So I consider myself a social scientist, although I teach law. And since the mid-1990s, I've used ethnographic modes of research data gathering, so observational studies, conversations, that kind of thing. I spent best part of 16 years doing observations on football crowds and what are now termed risk supporters, what used to be called hooligans. Right. Looking at how they were policed and how they experienced the law at football matches. And more recently, I used ethnographic research doing observations of police officers in the north of England on response, neighbourhood, organised crime disruption. So very keen on ethnographic approaches to research. I think it's got a lot to deliver to the social sciences and to law.
Yeah, so what's your interaction with getting into football? The reason I asked is because I did sport and then academia. I tend to find most people who are in that sort of area did academia but always loved sport, and I was wondering which way you went with it.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a career academic. I went straight to university and then went straight on to a PhD. I didn't even do a master's. So right. I was a football fan, and I mean, we're recording this during lockdown and the behind closed doors football has just started. I'm a season ticket holder at Old Trafford. I have very, very little interest in watching the football on telly at the moment, because what I was always interested in was the crowds.
Yes.
It was the roar of the crowd, the movement of the crowd. That was what really, really got me interested in football, and got me interested in football in a way that it didn't get me interested in other sports. So I was very much interested in football as a fan because of what the crowd did. And of course, particularly at that time in the 1990s, you couldn't really talk about crowd behaviour in football without talking about hooliganism.
That's funny, because I've played football all my life really badly. We used to love watching football on TV. And I started to go and watch Forest. I'm Nottingham born and bred. I started to go and watch Forest, and could afford a season ticket while I was doing my PhD. Not a season ticket. I could afford the ticket price because it was a tenner a go. And then as soon as I couldn't afford to go anymore, I started to watch football again and couldn't watch it anymore on TV because of the crowd. The crowd was, as my old prof used to say, the action is the juice. Going to the event and being involved in it and seeing it was just captivated me completely. And now I can't watch any football because of it. Going to a live game has kind of ruined it for me. It sounds like you've had a similar process. Okay, so I guess the first thing to kind of talk about is what for you was there may well be a personal justification for why you did the work that you did, but I wonder what the academic justification is for ethnography within football. And I know that there's a couple of projects that you may want to talk about and focusing on one. So maybe outline that project which you want to talk about most, and give us the academic justification for why you did it the way you did it.
Well, the original reason that I chose participant observation to look at football crowds was because originally when I first decided on which group of football supporters I was going to focus on, and I decided on Blackpool Football Club. I talked to a few people at the club, and not at the club, but from various supporters groups, and was getting stuff in interviews which just didn't quite make sense, or which I didn't quite believe. So I was talking to people who would say, "Oh, I never get involved in any trouble at all." And then you'd chat to one of their mates and said, oh, you know, I hear you've been talking to Psycho. You know, he's a nightmare. And I thought, all right, okay. And then I'd be talking to some young kids, and they'd be talking about going to matches and getting into fights. And I was just looking at it thinking, you know, I go to football. This just doesn't ring true. So I simply was highly skeptical of what people told me in interviews or what they would tell me in surveys. And I wanted to observe how they behaved with my own eyes. I wanted the onus for the truth of replicating that, you know, those life worlds, for want of a better term, placed on me rather than having to trust other people that I didn't necessarily know. And there's a fantastic quote from fantastic section in Peter Marsh's book, The Rules of Disorder, where he talks about interviewing this group of Oxford United fans and about how they, for half an hour, gave a blood-curdling account of what it was like to be an Oxford United fan in the 70s. And at the end of it, Marsh and his colleagues rewound the tape, played it back to them. And one of the fans said, that sounds a bit bad, doesn't it? And his mate said, yeah, it's not always like that. And they then proceeded on tape again to give an entirely different account of the same phenomenon. That this time emphasised what Marsh and his colleagues eventually called the rules of disorder. The fact that actually really serious violence was few and far between. There was always an undercurrent there, but you always expected the police to come in, and you didn't want to hurt anybody. You certainly didn't want to get hurt yourself. So I think that was a really good example of the problems on relying accounts, because even if people aren't deliberately deceiving you, and even if they don't have their own agenda, you quite simply put different emphasis on different tales that you tell, don't you, depending on your audience, what you expect them, what they want, you think they want to hear, what's in your mind at the time. And I think observational studies, particularly where you're embedded within the field, work around that. And of course, the other thing is that they try to, if you're properly embedded, then you're less likely to distort the field by your actions and by your presence. So those were the two real reasons I chose those approaches. And basically, they're the same justifications for the work I did covertly with the football fans, and also the kind of work I do these days with police officers, where, of course, they know I'm an observer, but I still try to hang around with them and stay close to them and attend as many observations as I can, so that they get used to me being around and feel they can trust me, and so I can feel I'm more likely to see actually what's happening in that field.
Yeah. And in terms of just picking up on the word you used there, when you were embedded, I think you just explained it slightly in terms of the police, but in terms of in the football crowds, how would you categorize your embeddedness? What position did you take, and did it change over the time that you're in there?
Yeah, I mean, it was Gold that set out his different levels of participation and observation. I think that has been quite roundly critiqued now, because of the realization that actually, when you're doing social research, your position changes. You don't pick a fixed position. I mean, ultimately, I was doing covert research with the fans for 3.5 years, so they had no idea that I was doing a PhD or writing on football hooliganism or legal responses to football crowds. They knew I was a student. I think most of them assumed I was an undergraduate student at a nearby university. So in that respect, I was as embedded as I could be. I would turn up in the morning, meet them at the pub or meet them on the trains going to matches, stay with them for the duration, essentially until either they went home or the pubs kicked us all out. So it could have been more embedded. I could have chosen to live in the same environments as those fans, and I didn't do that. I was living up the road in the university town of Lancaster rather than Blackpool. Yeah. But otherwise, I was acting in a way that they would expect one of their mates to do. Yeah. To the extent that I ended up being given a nickname, and that sometimes they got entirely different ideas about the type of person that I actually was.
Yeah, and I can't not touch on the being in the pub. How did you handle the booze side of situations and trying to still, to some degree, conduct research at the end of the night?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I'd had 3 years intense training as an undergraduate at Lancaster University, which has, or at least had, I think, 12 bars in a mile on its campus. And quite
Right.
often when it was raining, there wasn't an awful lot
Oh, I've just
to
lost
do.
you
So
there.
within a year of being there, I could quite easily sink 13 pints on a night out and not be in a great state, but I knew what was going on. So actually, over a longer period of time going to football, it was quite easier. And the fact I was able to do that, of course, enhanced the view that I fitted in with those groups, because I was able to hold my ale.
Yeah.
And it's not been good for my health, but in terms of conducting this type of research, it's been a very useful skill.
Yeah, and it always leads me to these sort of situations. My kind of similar one is my ability to get punched in the head and be relatively happy with that for a period of time at least. Not good for me, but helped collect data in different ways. And then that leads me to ask the kind of semi-obvious question that follows from that in terms of the ethics, not the ethics of your work, but now if we wanted to do that project, both the covertness, and I know that we can do covert research, but it makes ethics a problem. And also, if it transpired that one of my one's students was drinking while collecting data, is that something that we can do anymore? Have you tried to get a project like that through ethics recently?
So, yeah, I mean, I didn't have to put in an ethical approval form for that. This was back it was 1995 when I started doing my research, and the view of my supervisor was, well, as long as you can justify it in your PhD to the examiner,
Yeah.
that's good enough. And I wrote about this in the Journal of Qualitative Research a few years ago, and said that my justifications at the time, I think in retrospect, it wasn't quite as necessary to do the covert research as I thought at the time. I think I
Right.
would have probably been able to get access and get the sort of data that I did without going covert. But I wouldn't have been as comfortable with that data as I am now, because I was expecting to see, for example, a lot more fighting, a lot more disorder. The stuff that I actually saw seemed quite realistic. It was something that I could relate to as a fan that didn't go to football matches to fight. And in that sense, I think if I'd have got that data having not been covert, I'd have been quite skeptical that people were hiding stuff from me.
Right. Okay. So you personally had a better confidence in it
Yeah.
because of that. But still, do you think that project could get ethical clearance now?
I think a lot depends on the ethical committee you're going through.
Yeah.
Different ethics committees have
Yeah.
different justifications. So, for example, sociology has a British Sociological Association has different rules to the Socio-Legal Studies Association.
Right.
Ultimately, it's being able to justify that the ends. Say that the ends justify the means. So say, look, I would not be able to get this data were it not for the fact that I was covert. And without being covert, a very important part of social research would not go done. So I think you still can get covert research justified. And I'm aware of a number of projects recently that are a lot more dangerous than mine that have been given the go-ahead.
Right.
But I think it's being able to justify not only that you need to be covert, but also that the field you're observing is in need of enlightenment, that we need academic research in that area. And I think if we look at some areas, we look at some of the political violence which is going on at the moment. If we look at things like terrorism, if we look at the far right, these are areas that are in need of research. And it may be that the only way you can do that research is covertly. And I think if you can make that case, it's difficult, to have that justified, but it is by no means impossible.
Yeah. The one that I've always wanted to do, and this comes from a conversation I had with Michael Atkinson during the master's program at Loughborough, was dogfighting. I think he'd started a project on dogfighting and had to pull himself out because it was too difficult. And I've always owned dogs, and I've always wanted to do that piece of research. It scares me trying to put in the ethics to try and do it. So far, I've not been able to find a contact to be able to find anyone who does it. But it's always one when I hear of projects like this, I think, okay, it reminds me of that. The other problem I have with an ethics proposal that I'm going to put in, which you might have a comment on, is basically going into a gym without really much to go and find. When I went into the boxing gym, it was quite clear I was going to go and talk to people about how and why they enjoy doing violence to each other, ritualistic violence at least. Whereas the next project I want to do is to just go into a gym and see what I find. But I'm in a science and technology department, and they're not very keen on a project which just says I'm going to go and knock around in a gym for 2 years and see what happens. Have you ever put an ethics form in for something like that? You know, a very kind of almost exploratory, I'm just going to spend time in a space and I don't know what I'm going to find yet.
I haven't, and unfortunately, the opportunity for doing that in academia just diminishes the further on in your career you get. You can get,
of course, yeah.
You know, if you have the time when you're an early career researcher, quite often when you're doing a PhD, to be able to do that kind of exploratory ethnography.
Yeah.
Generally, when you get to the stage that I'm at in academia, you're very much expected to be able to justify exactly what it is you're doing and what you hope to achieve.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that type of ethnography outside of anthropology departments is I think highly unusual.
Yeah, it's a stone I'm going to have to try and turn at some point, because I'm determined to try and do it, but I know they're going to be asking me for outputs and all the rest of it. Anyway, so we're going to move on eventually to the kind of successes that you got from the field. But before we get onto the kind of good stuff to finish, because that will kind of be kind of getting towards the end of our discussion, what about some of the problems that you found? So what along the way, can you think of a story or two or something of difficulties you had, and then how you might have overcome them in the process of doing the research?
Yeah, I mean there is a long and sorry tales of problems that I encountered in the field, from getting confronted by people who wanted to fight me, through to being arrested, being manhandled by police, being tear gassed, being baton charged, chased around by various groups of fans. So there are a number of those type of incidents that occurred, although of course they were really useful in terms of the data gathering. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they were problems in terms of doing the research. Getting access is obviously your major problem. With football, that was quite easy. You just needed to simply turn up at the right time, be in the right time, the right place. It was very easy to get access. A lot more difficult with the work on policing, just because of the levels of distrust about academia.
Right.
Generally,
that's interesting.
Yeah, generally the feel amongst many frontline officers is that it's not, you know, the academics don't have their best interests at heart. They see them all as being racist, and you know, they're there to try and change what they do. It's different with the more senior officers. I think the biggest problem I had when going back to football was not being seen to be an undercover academic, which never happened, nor seen to be an undercover police officer, which happened a few times. The most serious problems I had was when people thought I was a journalist.
Exactly the same in boxing. In fact, I was consistently identified as a journalist, because they couldn't describe another thing of somebody who might want to take notes.
Yeah, and while people, you know, generally don't, you know, in football risk groups, they have serious qualms about beating up an undercover police officer because it obviously has serious repercussions. They don't have those qualms about doing the same to a journalist. So, and you know, this has been a problem that's followed me around. Particularly now, I tend to do overt observations rather than covert. When I was out in Marseille in 2016 at that major riot, I was confronted by a group of England fans who saw me talking into a dictaphone and assumed I was a journalist. And, the view was generally football fans had got a very, very rough ride from journalists, and journalists weren't considered to be their friend, and therefore I wasn't welcome.
So any ways that you can think of that you manage that and get past it?
It was generally deception and trickery, finding ways to make sure that I didn't take notes when people could see. I would have a dictaphone, and I would talk into a digital dictaphone as if it was a mobile phone, as if I was having a conversation with my mate, and as if it was a two-way conversation.
Right, very good.
And
yeah,
then
you
could take notes as you were going along, and people wouldn't notice you were taking notes. So yeah, going back to the ethical issue, most of the tactics which I used were highly unethical. They were to disguise the fact that I was a researcher from the people I was researching.
Right, yeah. And a similar story from how I moved away from a notepad was I just started typing into my phone. It was very natural in the gym to text. So I just started typing into my phone and got away with it completely from that point on. Although I didn't have to get away with it, as you're saying. It was fine for them to think that I was a journalist or a student or something. They didn't really care about me. I think I can imagine the space where people are looking for you as a target, whereas in the gym I was just some lad who was no good at boxing. It was a very different situation. They basically didn't care about me. Okay, so then the successes. I think maybe one angle is novel, new, interesting findings, but then also what that has meant for moving forward, policy recommendations, how that's changed the world maybe in a positive way or something like that, as the successes that have come out of the work.
Yeah, well, I was carrying out my ethnographic work with football fans at the same time as other academics were looking at the social psychology of policing crowds in football. Right. And that provided an opportunity and an opening, because it meant that we could bring these two approaches together. And that means that some of the findings about football fan behaviour have fed into policing strategies and tactics at varying different forces. Sorry, excuse me, let me itch your nose. So in that sense, it's been useful. And I have also been approached to do work on things like safe standing, because of the expertise I have in football crowd behaviour. So there are opportunities there to actually bring together the football crowd behavioural aspect with that policy, lawmaking, strategic side of things in football. So hopefully I will have an impact over the longer period in terms of the legal framework and the policing of fans.
Yeah. And is there anything that you can think of in terms of getting very close to the fans and knowing the fans, being in that insider position? Is there anything you can think of that has maybe reduced your ability to see wider issues because you were so inside that space?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, this used to be called going native, didn't it?
Yeah.
Which shows the anthropological roots of ethnography. Yeah. I think the issue is less for good ethnographers. It's less about actually going native. It's less about taking on the biases of those that you're observing, because generally observers are aware of those biases. And if they're not, their supervisor or reviewers of their work will make them aware of those biases. I think the problem is when observers that have been embedded in the field for too long just stop seeing regular occurrences in that field as being unusual and not worthy of note.
Yeah.
And I think it's impossible for any ethnographer not to go native in that respect. Because if you're doing your job properly, you are just, you're looking at these, you're normalizing stuff in the field. And it's caught me out. And really the best way you can try and mitigate against going native in that respect is to just disseminate your work. Talk about it in as much detail, and in terms of, ethnography being a writing process, describing what you're seeing in detail, going into that thick description. And then if you're normalizing stuff, there's a greater chance that people who've not been in that field will pull you up and say, hang on a minute, what do you mean? Why have you explained this but not that? That sounds interesting to me.
Yeah.
So it really is that process of dissemination, particularly at conferences, that I think is really useful as being your best weapon to try and stop yourself normalizing stuff and not writing about it.
That's great, because in the previous video I talked about one of our roles is to try and make the strange feel familiar, but then also we have to make that familiar seem strange again.
Yeah.
And in that video I gave no practical guidelines for how to do that, so you've just given one there. That's excellent. Yeah, I think you're right. The supervisor process, I remember speaking to my prof and saying that I really knew something. I really knew it because I was in there. He made me very, very aware that I didn't, because I was in there, and that I could have missed many, many other things. That was good. Okay, last couple of things. One is to somebody who's just about starting their PhD and is thinking about doing some sort of immersive research or maybe a master's project. What kind of 2 or 3, maybe more tips could you give them as a start point? Anywhere you like, in terms of access or reading or whatever you think.
Well, I mean, I think doing wide reading about ethnography and ethnographic approaches, I would recommend. So don't just read ethnographies about the particular area you're doing research in. Obviously, you need to be aware of those and you need to engage with them. But actually, in terms of styles of ethnography, have a read of the many, many different approaches that are out there. In terms of access, just keep an open mind in terms of the access you can get and the different routes that you can approach the subject and the area you're interested in. And just generally in terms of doing both descriptive approaches to the social sciences and also starting any PhD, I would just always advise students to just write, to put down as much as you can in a format which you'll be able to go back to it. Don't worry about, using specific types of software to analyze your data. The key thing is that you find a way that you can retrieve the information you want. And write as much as you can early on. I mean, essentially, when you start off in a field, you don't know what's going on. You'll write down absolutely everything because it could be important. So when I started doing the research with the police 6-7 years ago, I would start every single field note recording what the weather was like.
Right.
Because I thought it might be important.
Yeah.
And after 6-7 years, myself and my colleague, we found that loads of things influenced police decisions in terms of the utilisation of discretion and the street powers. The one thing we didn't find made any difference whatsoever was the weather. But of course, I didn't know that at the time. So you will inevitably, at the start of a project, you will need to write down much more. And at the end, when you're aware of the different areas that you need to unpick before you reach that point of saturation, you need to, that will narrow down. And it may be that actually you're going out for a day's observation and you will write 2 lines of notes at the end of it, whereas you'll have written an entire book the first observation you do.
Yeah. And just to clarify that the point of saturation, because I think people who are probably listening to this will not necessarily know what that means.
So the idea of the point of saturation is you get to a point in your observations or however you're collecting your data where you think, right, well, I know what is going on. Any data which I get is telling me stuff that I already know.
Yeah.
I've reached that point. Sometimes you won't ever reach that. We never reached the point of saturation in our observations with police officers because our main finding was that change was the dominant feature in policing.
Right.
Yeah. And therefore, which isn't helpful. So we would never reach saturation point because something was always changing, and we spent most of the time trying to keep up. But generally, the longer you're in the field, the less notes you'll need to make and the more focused you'll become. But also, the more time you'll find yourself twiddling your thumbs and thinking, well, actually, I'm wasting time in the field. Oh, the other thing I would suggest to anybody starting out ethnographic research is keep a track of how many hours you spend in the field.
Yes.
Because at the end of your project, you'll think, oh, actually, I want to put, I spent so many thousand hours in the field, so many hundreds of hours. And then you'll end up having to go back and try and keep a track of that.
Yes, excellent. My a PhD student who's currently working with me is fantastic at that, and it's something that I was always very poor at. She did it instantly, just kept a real good track, and she's got hundreds and hundreds of hours. Some of the stuff is observing fight events, which can start with the weigh-ins at 10 and finish at 1 in the morning. She just racks the hours up. I think it kind of hurts her quite a lot to do those hours sometimes in terms of her ability to focus later on in the day. But excellent. And one last question then. If there was a key text that you might send somebody to, whether it's an old classic or something new, have you got anything that you could recommend?
What would I recommend? I mean, in terms of football, I still think Gary Armstrong's Hooligans is as good as anything. I think that's somebody that really got into a group that completely trusted him and had complete access. And I have absolute total faith in his data. In terms of more controversial one, probably. Alice Goffman's On the Run, of course, has been in the news a lot in terms of her level of access, and I think those are two good opposing styles, really, and it tells us something else important about ethnography, because a lot of stuff written about ethnography is about being an insider and the value of being an insider in terms of not distorting the field, knowing that you're getting good data. But I think we also have to realise that you can be quite privileged in that position. So, if you're a white male, for example, you're quite privileged for that insider position in football, for example. And that's not always a healthy thing to do. We don't really want a situation where people commenting about football fans are all white men. So sometimes actually being an outsider can bring you more value. And of course, that was Alice's position getting her research on the Run, and she got a lot of stick for it. So those are two that just jump out for me. One, because I'm really interested in football, and the other just because of its scope and the controversy which followed. I think it raises a lot of very, very important ethical issues, particularly towards the end of Alice Goffman's book.
Excellent. I think that'll be useful. I think it's nice to get that sort of. I may be wrong, but I don't see academics talk in this fashion. I see the famous academics talking about this, that, and the other in physics and whatever. Sam Harris's and whoever else, but I don't see much from kind of people doing stuff in our sort of area. So hopefully
much of this sort of conversation, really. No, I think you're absolutely right. It will be useful. It'll help people out, and also it's quite good to be able to ground you when you're reading people's work.
That's it. That's one of the biggest things. I'm writing all my boxing work up, and I'm writing it as a book, so I can get rid of all of the academic daft way that we write things, and I'm writing it in that style. So at the same time as I'm writing that, I'm recording these videos, and I know it's the cross section between how I teach, which the students can understand, and then the papers that I ask them to read, which they struggle with. Without the two, they have no chance. They just go to the paper. But if they understand it and understand where you've come from, they follow along with the process far easier. And I think that's what this will do, is when people go to the stuff that you've written, they'll be able to like contextualize it. And it's almost as if they're hearing you talk about it in this sense, helps them hear you talk about it in the paper. It comes off the paper a bit better, I think. But anyways.
Yes.
All right. Thanks again.
Okay. I'll speak to you. Cheers. Bye.